sign-up sheet over by the donuts. Today we are particularly fortunate in having Al Sargis speak on some economic and political and military factors to consider in the collapse of the Soviet military. And this is the talk that Al gave in China several weeks ago, and it was very well received, and we've been looking forward to Al talking. Al, as you know, is the founder of the Frederick Engels Institute of Marxist War and Military Analysis. It is also located here at the Niebyl Proctor Marxist Library. So, without further, we'll hand it over. Al will talk for about an hour. We'll take a break to collect any money you have, and then go to Q&A and whatever. So, turn it over to the NCO in charge. Thank you.
General rule. Anybody not get one of these brochures about the Institute? Okay. I also have copies of the bibliography that I use for this paper. If you're interested in some of the sources, it's located up here. And I also have a few copies of, I gave, well, a couple of other talks I gave in China at Tsinghua University and the Chinese University of Politics and Law. And this is about perestroika and the military. It's only about 2.5 pages. Perestroika? Okay. It's only about 2.5 pages, and is mainly designed to raise questions, but it covers certain aspects that I don't cover in my talk. About 1 year ago today, I got a call from Wadia Halabi, who said, Al, said, get prepared to write something because I think I've got this conference in China, on the go, finally. He'd been talking to me for about a year, wanting to get it going. And I said, great. I said, when is it going to be? He said, before the year is out. And I said, and what do you want me to talk about? He said, I want you to talk about the role of the military in the collapse of socialism in the Soviet Union. And I said, you're only going to give me to the end of the year? I said, I don't know that much about the Soviet Army. That's not my specialty. I only read like one book on the history. I knew something about Soviet military doctrine. Something about the Marxist-Leninist theory of war in the military that came out of the Soviet Union. I said, but you want me to do something on contemporary stuff? Post-World War II stuff? I don't know anything, basically. I know very little. And so he said, you told me all about this stuff about when you got your master's degree in sociology, that the only thing that ever stuck with you was how to do research. And you told me you could do research on any subject, just on that basis. He says, so I'm counting on you. So I proceeded to study. Fortunately, it was the conference was postponed twice, so it did not occur until May of this year. In the meantime, I bored people because every time they'd say, what are you doing, Al? I said, I'm reading stuff about the Soviet military. A couple of weeks later, what are you doing, Al? I'm reading stuff about the Soviet military. 4 months later, repeat, repeat, repeat. Okay? And so that's all I read. That's all I immersed myself in. So I gave essentially 2 talks on that particular subject. One was to the Academy of Social Sciences, and the other was to the Academy of Military Sciences. I'm going to give you the one that I presented at the Academy of Military Sciences. It's about 10 minutes longer than the other one, but I think it deals in more detail for those that are not familiar with certain aspects of the topic. Okay, now the first part is I began with a quick synopsis of the what happened on August 19th and a couple of days preceding August 19th, 1991, the so-called standoff at the White House. Okay. Let me start with this real quick, On the morning of August 19th, 1991, the Soviet Minister of Defense, Dmitry Yazov, placed the Soviet armed forces on combat readiness alert. Within 2 hours, the State Committee for the State of Emergency, I'll just call it the State Committee from now on, okay? The State Committee for the State of Emergency, composed of party, government, economic, and military and security officials, announced that President Gorbachev was ill and that the State Committee was assuming control under the provisions of a state of emergency. The State Committee's immediate reason for this, they said, was the Union Treaty, which would have given more sovereign powers to the republics, and they said also a reason was the deteriorating economic conditions in the USSR. The State Committee's several resolutions made no mention of the preservation of socialism, of the socialist state, or the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Later that day, Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Federation, who had resigned from the Communist Party more than a year earlier, sent out appeals and decrees from the Russian Supreme Soviet building, which called the White House. He declared that the State Committee and its decisions were illegal and unconstitutional. He asked for the support of the Russian people and urged a general strike. Up to 70,000 Moscow residents responded by marching to the White House. Meanwhile, the military trucks, armored personnel carriers, and tanks began to patrol the city and move to the White House. When the tanks surrounded the White House but permitted persons to gather, people began to fraternize with the troops, giving them food and beverages. One major told the crowd that they were not ordered to shoot them. As if to confirm that statement, Boris Yeltsin mounted tank number 110 of the Taman Division and urged opposition to the State Committee. Within the White House, Colonel General Konstantin Kobitz took command of its defense. Soviet Army veterans of the Afghanistan War organized the defense of the White House, both inside and outside, with the assistance of some internal security troops and Moscow police. In the early afternoon, Major General Alexander Lebed brought a message to Yeltsin from Colonel General Pavel Grachev, the commander of the airborne paratroop force. And the message was that a battalion of the Ryazan Regiment of paratroopers would come to the White House in its defense. Both Lebed and Grachev were regarded as heroes of the Afghanistan War. That evening, General Lebed led his troops to the White House in armored vehicles carrying the Russian tricolor flag rather than the Soviet flag. He was later ordered by Grachev to withdraw the next day. On the afternoon of August 20th, military and security leaders associated with the State Committee made plans for a 3 a.m. attack on the White House and the arrest of Yeltsin by paratroopers and internal security troops. By nightfall, 2,000 military and civilians were organized in armed defense of the White House, with tens of thousands of others standing around the White House in support of them. However, at midnight, General Grashev refused to order the paratroopers to attack. And later, Marshal of Aviation Yevgeny Shopstakov told the commander of the internal troops that if he attacked the White House, the Air Force would bomb the headquarters of the Ministry of Internal Security. Commanders of KGB troops either refused orders or remained neutral. Between 1 and 2 a.m. on August 21st, the Minister of Defense, Yazov, called off the attack, citing fears of massive bloodshed and possible civil war throughout the Soviet Union. At 9 a.m., there was a meeting of the military collegium, which is like the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where Yazov, at the urging of the commanders of the Air Force, Navy, and Strategic Missile Forces, signed the order for the troops to return to their permanent bases, something that had already been going on for several hours already. The State Committee was now incapable of enforcing its decrees, and for all practical purposes, the defense of the Soviet Union collapsed with its key institution, the Soviet Armed Forces. Okay, now that's a brief summary of what happened during those couple of days, which were basically, although the Soviet Union officially did not end until a few months later, in effect, that was the end of the Soviet Union. So what I want to deal with are some factors in the military failure to oppose the counter-revolution, okay? And then to discuss how these factors impacted on the military effectiveness. This, you might say, is where my hour begins. Okay, factors of the military failure to impose counter-revolution. Well, there are many reasons why the State Emergency Committee failed, including poor planning and poor implementation, unrealistic expectations for active public and military support, the incompetence and wavering of its members, including the drunkenness. The focus of this paper is on some economic, political, and military factors that resulted in the military's failure to carry out the orders of the Emergency Committee and to act decisively against counter-revolution in the form of Boris Yeltsin. The Soviet armed forces, like any military, reflected the contradictions within society, and more specifically within the Communist Party. I'm going to look at several of these. One is perestroika. Another is new thinking. Third is accumulated problems within the military. All three are dialectically interrelated and played out in ways that were initially unanticipated. First, perestroika. State industry, that economic restructuring. State industry and the military have been closely linked in Russia since the 19th century. In Tsarist times, the aristocracy viewed capitalism skeptically as taking industry away from Tsarist control and putting it in private hands. Under the pressure of the growing use of the military to conquer and police the borderland areas, an expanded military industry was instituted under Tsarist state control, which was the first state-owned industry in Russia prior to Soviet times. Okay? In Soviet times, especially because of external threats from capitalist countries, this relationship expanded quantitatively and qualitatively. In the 1980s, as capitalist contradictions escalated and with them military threats to the Soviet Union, Soviet military-related production accounted for 35 to 40% of the output of heavy industry. The best scientists, engineers, designers were employed in the military production sector. And this sector also produced the most technologically advanced and reliable products. Yeah. Anyone who's been to the Soviet Union or familiar with Soviet consumer goods know that they had very low priority in terms of quantity and in terms of quality. In the 1980s, I said that. Indeed, it would be no exaggeration to say that the Soviet Union had operated as a war economy since the 1930s. During the so-called, quote, stagnation years of the 1970s and early 80s, it was realized that social and consumer goods were being shortchanged, especially considering the Soviet people's increasing demand for them. And Gorbachev, of course, was not the first leader since Brezhnev to realize this. The budget squeeze resulting from the burden of military productions prompted Gorbachev to propose economic restructuring or perestroika. Okay, this is I think, a very important point, that it was military production, okay, which prompted Gorbachev to change the economic policy. But the changes in military production raised concerns with those with vested interests in it. Managers and workers in heavy industry, ideologists who identified socialism with a growing means of production in heavy industry, the military whose quantitative view always emphasized more, among others. To overcome these interests, the reformers led by Gorbachev eventually focused on political reform to outflank his opposition and to get as many of the Communist Party members and Soviet public on his side. Gorbachev initially instituted glasnost, or openness, to expose and criticize current economic practices. This spiraled out of control and was used by those wishing not only to introduce market reforms in the state sector, but to abolish state control over the economy in favor of capitalism under various guises, such as cooperatives. In any case, not only did perestroika in practice fail to stabilize the economy and raise living standards, it had the opposite effect. Such was the resistance in the military industrial sector that perestroika's program for military industry, which was conversion to civilian goods, had only very limited implementation. In fact, in 1991, military industry was about as strong as it was in 1985. Second, new thinking. New thinking refers to foreign policy and military doctrine, which of course are related intimately. It is here, in my view, that the greatest political and ideological changes impacted the condition and effectiveness of the military. Gorbachev believed that perestroika could be implemented only if there was a new international relations based not on class struggle, but on, quote, mutual security, unquote, even if it meant contributing to the security and strength of the bourgeois states. This resulted not only in ideological revision, but in unilateral Soviet military reductions via disarmament under the slogan of mutual arms control measures.
Well, could I ask you to pause for 1 second so I can change the battery?
Pause.
Thank you.